Ladies and gentlemen, hello again and welcome back to Don't Worry About the Government. My name is Chris Novembrino, and joining me today on the show for our post-election special, our first guest in this kind of guest-a-thon post-election, because there's a lot to talk about, is Bruce Carlson of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I actually slept well. I was one of those people who actually slept on election night. So I just said, okay, I see the way this is going, and we're not going to get an answer at midnight. So time to time to go to bed. So I am actually refreshed and fine.
Yeah, no, the last few days, though I have been eagerly awaiting the results, if not just because of the political intrigue, because of when you do a podcast, you have to figure out when you're actually going to record and everything. And so these results coming out kind of jam you up a little bit. But I was making sure to get full night's sleep every night because election workers have to sleep too. And you just have to assume that these results are going to take time. And there's no reward for being first to call an election. And if anything, there's just a big penalty for being first and being wrong about it when you call an election.
Well, I mean, I heard I was just listening to a cast recently that interviewed the fellow from VNS who had made the call in 2000 to call Florida for Gore at 8 o'clock, and his whole story and how his life became a nightmare after that. He went from having done election calculations since the 60s to in 2000, and then becoming kind of a pariah. So yeah, it's really tough for the networks. And this one, I think, though, there was a little bit of like a they seem to apply like a COVID face mask to calling any states. A lot of like we have. I don't even know if MSNBC has called Arizona yet. Where Fox News did for
Yeah,
Biden. It's a
right,
little bit
right.
weird.
No,
um,
it's been strange to see, yeah, the withdrawal from calling some of these states where, like for example, in the case of Arizona, the population is distributed in Maricopa and Pima counties. I used to live in Arizona. I lived there for 8 years, from age
mm,
10 to 18. And most of it's in Maricopa, which is the Phoenix Metroplex and the kind of satellite cities around it. And the Phoenix Metro has only gotten bigger, and it started to include places like Surprise, Arizona, places that were like kind of almost like tourist attractions when we first moved out there. Like they're right on the outskirts of the metro, and you can still kind of see historic Arizona. That's all been fleshed out, but it's all in Maricopa County. And then you still have a population center, of course, in Tucson.
mm,
Outside of that, those are the only two cities in. Then there's like Flagstaff and Prescott, but like they're teeny tiny. Like they are like the equivalent of small suburbs in Phoenix. They're just a couple up north there. So it was weird for networks to be gun shy on calling Arizona, in my opinion, just because you really only needed to look at the outstanding votes in two counties in the case of Arizona. And I mean, even when you get down to the vote total, I think it's still under 2 million voted.
oh yeah, it's a lot. Well, Arizona's a little bit trickier. I was doing some calcs myself, and definitely the Trump vote in Maricopa County was starting to come in late. Um, I mean, we this is the whole thing. This metaphor is like coming in late or coming in slow. People voted.
And they
People
got
voted. It's
counted later on.
we're
Yeah.
reporting the counting, but it is funny. It's and to me, it's the same like epistemological question of like how we view campaigns as a whole. Like we consider them to be like horse races when really it's just voters deciding. I mean, there are events, there are changes, but generally speaking, it's like voters making up their mind, perhaps at different times if the polling's even right. But it's really just people going to vote. I mean, it is funny that there's a little bit more now because of all the mail-in voting that people made their decision at different times. I still think in just the same as most years, a lot of people had their decision, and it's just a matter of when it gets counted, when it gets known, when a pollster is able to record it properly, all of those things. But we turn it into a horse race when really it's more of a stationary event.
Yeah, all the evidence suggests that the large majority of people made up their mind on this election well prior to even October this year.
Mm.
And so a lot of those votes were in. I have been looking at exit polls, and they're one of the largest groups for Trump are the people who made up their mind in the last 2 weeks of the election. But even then, it was only 20% of respondents who voted for Trump. Like it was a very small percentage. I'm with you by and large what we saw here, and this is also why you saw so many people mailing in their votes early, right? People
Well, if you don't,
who they're
you
gonna
know,
vote for.
you got an incumbent. So if you have an incumbent and you haven't decided yet, there's going to be a slight lean to the incumbent on those people, because if somebody's been president 4 years and you're not against them, I mean, they're
You might not realize it, but you're
slight
actually for them. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you haven't come up with something in 4 years to be against them, and particularly this year, the economy, COVID, and things like that. If that's not yet your verdict, by the time you're reaching like the end of October, that small percentage of true, really undecided, but still are going to vote, which I think is a small group, tends to go that way. 92, something like this happened where all of a sudden Republicans, and you have spinsters like Mary Madeline, who were really good at kind of turning a nothing into a something. And she was saying, hey, the momentum's with us. But it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if George H.W. Bush was like moving a point up in the polls, a lot of it taking from Perot,
Right,
a
right.
little bit from Clinton, a point or two up in the polls, and then turn that into momentum's all with us over the weekend here at the end. And it's like, but the gap is still pretty large between Bush and Clinton. It's just, but we got the momentum on our side. It's like, well, do you really have momentum, or it's just this kind of like bounce that occurs when one candidate appears to be the one that's going to win? And so you even have a little bit of chafing on that might occur at the end, a little bit of like, well, I want to make sure that, we
Keep on the toes.
yeah, keep this guy into like, oh, he thinks he's the big guy, big shot. Now, Americans, that seems to be historically the way we view a lot of things. I don't want the front runner. I want the underdog. And if somebody becomes the underdog in the end, maybe a little bit upward, but so small that not significant. Could have happened to Truman. I think actually, the more I studied 1948, there is no underdog story, even with Truman. In other words, I believe, just like now, election pretty much decided in October, most minds. The problem is they stopped polling most of the agencies then in the beginning of like October 1st, even last couple of polls. And it was a little too early. The methodology wasn't good, and they were off by 5%. They said 5% Dewey when it was 5% Truman in the popular vote. By the way,
Wasn't that
this group,
10%?
let's say again.
Isn't that 10% then?
Oh, yeah, 10%.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if
The
it's
poll was off by
oh,
5%.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Poll was off by 5%. But the when you look at it, the difference is not really that much. I mean, the 3% margin of error is pretty standard. So this great mistake of history is not really that different. Um,
So one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of historicity is, as we've discussed before, incumbents don't lose all that often, and the last couple of times an incumbent has lost in the American system, it's been because there's been the presence of a third party candidate that drew at least some interest and some buzz away from the incumbent. In the case you mentioned, George H.W. Bush, H. Ross Perot was someone who was drawing away from Bush, talking about the giant sucking sound and fiscal responsibility. He was taking away from a lot of Bush's kind of fiscal conservative Republican voters. And some of them ultimately come home when the Reform Party collapses. And in the case of Carter, in the 1980 election, John Anderson was present, at least for a sizable chunk of it, and enough to kind of get into people's minds that there was this guy, John Anderson, running for president, and people were getting polled and asked about him and that sort of thing. When is the last time that an incumbent president has not won re-election in basically a straight up two-person race?
well, see, that's a great point to make, because actually the last two have involved some form
Right.
of third party candidate. So that's 28 years. Incumbent defeats are very rare. It's 28 years for the last one. So the entire Gen Z has grown up with presidents nothing but reelected.
And millennials too. Yeah,
Some millennials
yeah, I
too. Yeah.
was born in '86, and so yeah, no, I mean, presidents get
Well, you got
reelected.
the 92. Yeah,
Yeah,
you got the
not, yeah,
92.
that's true. Yeah, but yeah, Gen Z's basically accepted this as normative. And yeah, I mean,
Well, they didn't do anything to cause it, is not what I'm saying, but they
yeah,
they weren't around much to cause it. But their whole life, they've experienced nothing but presidents get reelected. And actually, that's not too far from history, because most presidents get reelected. It's about 75% almost throughout history, and no difference between, because I'll always get the classic, like, what's that's going back a long time. You're talking about John Adams. It's like, it doesn't change really that much over history. And I haven't computed it with a Trump, but you're still in that zone of about 75%. Now, some presidents don't run. Sometimes their party didn't nominate them, so they didn't get a chance to run. There are those. It's still, even if you were to fold those in, you still have pretty much more rarer than that a president is reelected than not. And the ties are going towards incumbents. The ties that I see are 48. Um, and by the way, that was 48. It was 50% for Truman, 45 for
oh,
Dewey.
okay,
The polls simply reversed that. That's all. It was, they were just off by 5%. So the president's winning these ties. 1916 was another tie. Woodrow Wilson wins it. Where you have presidents not super popular, and the opponent's like okay, but not the greatest. 2004, Bush, he wins that too with a very narrow popular vote margin, and really coming down to the state of Ohio. So presidents are winning. The incumbent presidents are winning. Like if there's every reason, and if there's not a lot of enthusiasm for the president, but it's not overwhelming, like the country's not in an absolute disaster of a depression or something. American voters seem to favor incumbents. That's what makes this so important, even if it is, and the votes still being counted at this time in all states, even if it is a narrow victory. So you have 28 years for the last one, 40 years for the one before that. As you bring up, both of them involve some amount of third party action in there. Definitely Anderson in 1980 definitely enhanced Reagan's win. Tip O'Neill always felt that Reagan's administration got this sheen in the beginning that helped him to stomp over legislative opponents because of the size of the win. And that's all Anderson. I mean, you have a very different electoral map that almost looks like Carter could be like a Grover Cleveland who's going to come back in 4 years if you don't have Anderson pulling Carter's vote in a lot of states. Because while Anderson had been a Republican, he was a moderate Republican, and Carter was a moderate Democrat. It's kind of very similar politically. Also, Anderson has Pat Lucey as his VP candidate. Well, Pat Lucey was a supporter of Ted Kennedy. So it's a lot of that, pulling that Kennedy vote of people that were upset about the Kennedy-Carter primary and pulling them to Anderson. So
and
gets
also
about
creating like a unity centrist ticket. Yeah, yeah. In both cases, the third party challenger in '92 and 1980 is strong and is making an appeal from the center. So it's not like a green or libertarian style candidate that's on either one of the wings. It's, H. Ross Perot saying, I'm going to come in and make the Republicans and Democrats work together in the debates. It's John Anderson working with a Ted Kennedy supporter.
right. And he wasn't pursuing anything particular. A couple of his plans might have been considered radical. I believe there was a tax that he wanted to institute, perhaps a gas tax, which not, we're talking about 1980 when this is a huge issue.
Yeah, right after
Uh,
gas lines and everything. I
yeah.
mean, that's gas is on
Uh,
people's minds the way masks are on people's minds now.
and then you have, so that's even going 40 years for that second most recent incumbent defeat. Then you have to go to 44 years to Carter beating Ford, but that's a narrow squeak. In fact, Ford is definitely picking up at the end there. Carter makes a number of gaffes, does an interview in Playboy, which he shouldn't have done. Big
Right, right.
mistake. Hurts his base. He wins, oddly enough, because he's able to keep the solid South Democrat. South that had voted for FDR, had voted for Grover Cleveland, James Buchanan, and even John Kennedy. comes in for Carter. Enough of those states, South Carolina, uh, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. These states come for Carter, Georgia, and he's able to
What
win
the Democratic
1976.
Party it was in 1976.
Oh, here's a great one. Virginia, he actually loses to Ford
Whoa.
because Northern Virginia supports Ford. And the Democrat Carter is getting counties like Wise County at the end of the state, the more rural counties, and
Sure.
it's just a total reversal of things, which is quite interesting. In your home state of Texas, where 76 is that's a swing state in
Yeah.
Texas.
All right, all right. Yeah,
Once
no, Ann
again,
Richards becomes governor. Yeah, and then George W. Bush
so
becomes governor.
surprisingly, today in 1976, Ford wins Dallas. Carter wins the state with the support of all those rural counties in the rest of the state, but he loses Dallas, and he actually loses it by 10 points. So it's an interesting time. So Carter has a heck of a very narrow popular vote win, loses California, loses Connecticut, loses New Jersey. Actually, I'm not sure about Connecticut. He loses New Jersey, loses California. It's pretty big states. He loses the entire West, and yet becomes president. That's, he barely wins Ohio. That's really what puts Carter over in that election. So you're talking about, and that's after Watergate, and that's after
Yeah, right,
Harding Nixon.
right,
So
right.
look, incumbent defeats are rare. You know what? If you want to go beyond that, you have to go all the way back to 1932 and Hoover and FDR, and Hoover still gets 40% of the vote.
And okay, so I think with Ford and Hoover and now Trump, we do sort of see the contours of what has to happen in order for an incumbent president to not get reelected. And it's more than just merely performance of the executive, although performance of the executive matters in the case of all three of them. America frustrated with Ford because Ford pardoned Nixon. America frustrated with Trump for any myriad of reasons.
Yep.
America frustrated with Hoover because of the Great Depression and his poor response to it. I think that does seem to be a bit of a historical through line here.
Yeah, it's hard to
It's a
defeat.
learnable thing.
You could almost simplify it, and some models do, but they often fail because of this reason, because they're too simple. You could simplify it and say a lot of the reason you lose is the economy. And that's it. If you don't have a bad economic situation, it wasn't too bad in 76. Now, you had a little inflation. It actually was subsiding in that year. We'd consider it high now, but it wasn't as high in 76 as in past years. GDP growth was pretty good for Ford. So it really was that fact that he had a bloody primary with Reagan and that he pardoned Nixon. So it's kind of like, I would say it's the triangle: scandal, intra-party fight, and economy. And
Yeah.
if you get those three, you're probably going to win. You could still lose the electoral college, as we kind of, but it's a good indicator. And despite what anybody says about the electoral college, and it has its faults, the best indicator of electoral college performance still remains the popular vote. It's just that unfortunately we've had what I would consider too many exceptions.
Well, this one was on the verge of being yet another exception
Yes.
in four states, totaling up to 57 electoral college votes. The margins, we're still waiting on all of the votes to be counted here. So I will qualify the statement with that. But the margins right now, as they stand, if they stay as narrow as they are, the libertarian vote influences the outcome in four of the key battleground states, totaling 57 electoral college votes. If the libertarians break for the Republican candidate 70-30, which I tend to think they would,
Right.
that would yet again result in the Republicans winning the electoral college while losing the popular vote.
I have a little difference on that, only because, see, I think when you reach a certain low level of a party's vote, then you have to just assume that they're going to get some amount of that vote.
Sure.
This was something I was talking about the 1884 election, which is the one that I compare most to this. Like, we could talk about that later. But the one thing that happened in that election, this prohibitionist candidate that just annoyed the heck out of the Republicans because he was stealing, quote, their votes. They didn't want to adopt a temperance platform. They didn't want to lose whiskey drinkers, right? Who does, as voters? So
Actually very important for a long time in early politics here in America.
a guy named John St. John runs his prohibition. So one of the things I looked at is like, okay, so he definitely turned that election because in the state of New York, he got 25,000 votes. Margin is 1,200. But when you get to 1916, there's actually a similar effect where in California, the prohibitionist candidate got enough votes to be the difference between Wilson and Hughes. But almost no one in history goes back and blames that on the prohibition candidate. It's a little bit of a factor. There's probably like 20 factors that led to Wilson's surprise win. Surprise Wilson more than anybody. His daughter tells him he got reelected, and he tells her to go leave the room. He wants to keep sleeping. I mean, he tell it to the Marines is his favorite line. I mean, he didn't even know he was going to get reelected. But the prohibitionist candidate difference in 1916 isn't what historians look at, because they were getting about 250 each year, and they got 250. So I think that's one of the things, you might want to kind of apply that here. Like,
Yeah.
there's always going to be a certain amount of third party vote, but I don't think that what's her name,
No,
Jorgensen.
Jorgensen, if anything, is a historically poor performing and underperforming Libertarian Party candidate. So, I mean, I am seeing a lot of Donald Trump supporters pointing to the Libertarian margins and basically saying, why are these people throwing away their votes? But I do agree with you as well that one, given the current ideological makeup and like policy goals such as they exist of the current 2020 Libertarian Party, I don't see really any concessions that the Republican Party could have made to really court libertarian voters more than like the Republican Party platform already is. There was no like magic button Trump could push on that front. And I also don't think they had Gary Johnson to contend with. If anything, if
Right.
Gary Johnson was running, I think that would make the margins larger for Trump. And then, I mean, when you want to talk about what, why did the Democrat win this election? I'm firmly of the belief the Democrat won this election because the Republican candidate made key mistakes during governing over the last 4 years and then during this campaign. Not the least of which was like getting COVID-19 and the messaging around that when this campaign's being debated and contoured around pandemic response. It was undermining to his closing statement of, I know how to best manage COVID-19. You could talk about the stimulus checks. You could talk about the Omaha rally in Nebraska's 2nd district. I mean, there are a number of other kind of
these go to incumbent performance. So you have an issue
right.
that's a big disaster in the country, and performance isn't seen as adequate. Statements aren't seen as adequate. Didn't help himself. Those horrible press conferences early in the year. Basically, the whole approach to the disease. Look, the thing was going to hit us, and whoever was president, there's a certain level of damage it was going to do. When the first SARS hit Hong Kong, where it started, in 2005, when the first SARS hit, nobody, even a very competent government there, very used to governing things with a lot of hospitals and doctors, could not fathom what a invisible, well, all viruses are invisible, but what a respiratory virus can do, and how quickly it can transmit. And that thing, even though it was contained, goes all the way to Toronto, Hanoi, and even Frankfurt before it's contained. And so I just say that to point out that, anybody could have badly performed as
No,
president
I
in that
agree with
issue.
you.
But
It's an optics thing.
Mhm.
I think the administration made so many different statements along the way here over the last 6 months that have really damaged them. Trump's early press conferences, where it was clear he did not know the briefings at the same level of detail as the medical professionals. Yes, obviously we talk about the injecting bleach thing, and to Joe Biden's point on the debate stage, even if, as Trump says, he was just joking about it. One, it's not really a thing to be joking about. It's not really a thing that people want jokes about injecting bleach to beat the virus, especially when people are scared and worried about the virus in April. And two, a lot of people didn't think it was a joke because CDC responses went up. Poison control responses went up because people were taking bleach and trying to experiment with bleach. I had listeners ask me about bleach baths, which is a thing that I had to explain.
Well, if you're talking about a bath, I mean, then I think it's like something they're pulling from like MRSA, or other
Right.
diseases where there might even be a very diluted, there might even be something to it. But
And
yeah,
I've done those, but why
okay.
is that? Why? And I
I'm doing one right now as I'm talking to you.
no, I've had to do because I had MRSA really bad in my early
Oh,
20s.
good
Yeah,
Lord.
no,
Good
I
Lord.
had, so I've had to do it. But why is that in people's minds? It's in people's minds because the president's talking about bleach, and to the
Yeah.
point of in the closing days of the campaign here, when Meadows comes out, Mark Meadows comes out and says we're not going to contain the virus, we're not going to control the virus. That is of this months long piece of statements from the administration that don't inspire confidence. And like in that sense, the response was subpar. And I think a lot of people felt the same way.
And then the question that everything's going to turn on here, if we look at the overall here, why this is so important is because if that was what did it, then there's then what you're going to hear, I believe, a lot of, especially as we get a year from this, 2 years from this, you get into 2022, there's a midterm, which if Biden's president is historically indicated to go bad for Democrats, the historical indication doesn't mean you automatically lose the House or lose the Senate. It just means it tends to go bad for the person in the White House. You can also organize your party and have a great message and change that, as Bill Clinton did in 98 or
George W.
George
Bush.
W. Bush did in 2002. And John Kennedy in 1962 held it to 1 seat loss, which is still considered a pretty good midterm result after the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can do things. You can have a big achievement. It's not impossible. It just means it's really tough. And people like Reagan, people like Trump, Bill Clinton all fell victim. Obama fell victim to that first year midterm, and some of them the second year midterm. So um, if you get into an atmosphere like this, we're getting 2 years away. Looking back at this election, I think where you're going to start to hear commentary is, well, that was all because of COVID. So it was like he would be president if it wasn't for a disease that he had no control over. Again, as we
That's
start.
going to be really interesting. The way they handle
Mhm.
that narrative, though, is going to really dictate. Like, that can go one of two ways, right? You can go, oh, it's all because of COVID. We need to be more responsible and rational in our response. We need to be a more serious party that governs in crises. Or Donald Trump would still be president but for COVID-19, and he got robbed of what was rightfully his ish.
I think the latter will be a very common refrain, just as you hear say things like very common to hear Nixon didn't do anything that other presidents didn't do. Like after you get removed from some of the facts of the case or the recency of the cases, um, you know, new narratives come out. And I think that's going to be a major one when there's even an admission that he lost, let's say. It's like, well, I lost. Okay. But, it was all because of COVID and I'm going to be back in 4 years. That's going to be what it's going to turn on. If it's that, it's going to be Grover Cleveland back in 4 years.
Yeah.
So I'm at least going to try.
He's going to at
If
least
it's,
try. Yeah.
if it's you really performed horribly and that sticks, people in the party will be like, we need a new direction. We can't, and that debate is going to happen in that party, like in the first and second year of this thing, and it's going to, of course, the 2022 midterm will turn a lot on that, depending on what kind of Republicans manage and win that midterm. All of those things are going to be, but I think that that's the case. The other scenario we could explore, but it's all hypothetical, is were we headed for economic trouble anyway? I know there are certainly a lot of indicators of that.
I'm a believer of that. I mean, I have, investments or whatever, and I certainly believed in 2018 that we were heading for an economic downturn going into 2019. And
People in manufacturing
yeah,
or in farming or in construction could already have told you a narrative about some of those things, particularly related to tariffs, where you can actually assign blame to the incumbent, having to do with that trade war. And they're probably like, look, prices of things are going up. Talk to people in construction about prices of some of the materials that
that's why
they
the
need.
yield curve was inverting in the tail end of 2019, well before the coronavirus was having any impact on the economy. And you were already seeing manufacturing talking about being in a recession in January, again, well before weeks, literally months before coronavirus is having any meaningful impact on the economy. So I think some of the signs of that are there as well. And that will also, I think, have a certain intellectual seduction and obfuscation in terms of understanding the president's economic policies. I think there will be this belief that the economy was rip roaring for the last 3.5 years, but for the fact of the coronavirus, when I think a closer, more economics and data driven study of the economy would show that the economy got very energized post the Trump tax cuts that were passed in 2017, but it was at the end of a 10-year economic cycle. And not
Mhm.
unlike the last time it was at the end of a 10-year economic cycle, we saw a ramp up and frankly, some fiscal policy done by the Republican administration at that point that energized that ramp up, but that led to certain industries overheating. And in the case of Trump, it was not the housing market, and as you were saying, it was manufacturing. And then you also had the impact of tariffs. So, like the overheat in this case is the market's overheating as other industries are just clearly flagging and underperforming.
Well, the
Um,
one good thing that's always been, the odd thing about this economy is it's a bad economy with a lot of people unemployed, low GDP growth because of coronavirus, obviously, big time negative growth in 2020. But you know what? If you want to borrow any money, fine, no problem, man. We'll give it to you.
and
You want
your
a credit card? No
401k is
problem.
still okay, which is really different from the last time too. And I think one of the things that Democrats were expecting here in 2020 was this will be a blowout like 2008, and it will be a blowout because Biden's sort of channeling like a little bit of an Obama light energy, and
Hmm.
everyone remembers the last time there was a recession, how that dragged people out to the ballot box. And they, kind of voted very forcefully in one direction because of the recession. And McCain said, it's kind of crazy to think about. McCain was sort of considered to be incompetent on the economy by saying the fundamentals of the economy are sound. Contrast that to some of Trump's responses on COVID-19. But I think what moved voters going to the ballot box and Republican voters was the fact that the stock market was in real trouble, which was tied to retirement plans and 401ks. And so people were feeling the recession in a much more tangible way than some people are this time. They have to stay at home. They have to wear Zoom, they have to wear Zoom. They have to wear masks, and they have to be on Zoom.
Right.
They don't have to usually do them both at the same time. You don't have to wear Zoom, fortunately. I think
It's a pain. It's an
I think this
inconvenience. So are
recession
the
is
masks.
hitting different. It's hitting different groups of people differently than 2008, which
Mhm.
hit everyone in a more uniform way. Because of the stock market's comparative strength throughout this recession, I mean, it dipped, but it dipped in a transient way. It dipped and it's already back
Yeah.
into rhythm.
Well, the stock market, I mean, it's important, but I think that it goes up and down, and I do recall in 1993, I think the one thing that Bill Clinton trap that he got into early on, the first problem that he had that you may not see with Biden because this is just 4 years out of power. Clinton was 12 years out of power for Democrats. He had to pull and have people run a government who were first of all in Congress, which doesn't, as you know, doesn't govern anything. They just write laws, right? They watch, they hold
They get
hearings, and they
paid.
write law. So he had to put congressional people in these positions. A couple of old Carter people were still around, but it was a pretty sloppy administration in the beginning, quite frankly. And one of the things he got trapped on is having run on the economy like that, and not totally different from Trump putting a market forward and making this the measure of the administration's performance, then got caught in reliance on that market for good news. And in his case, it was more of the bond market because that's related to T-bills and how you're going to finance the deficit. And in order to, be able to pass some of the plans that you want, they had to see a performance in the bond market when he did his economic plan that was
How come we
passed
never
by.
hear about T-bills anymore? This is a random question, but is there a
I'll
reason why
tell
we
you
don't?
why. I think
Yeah,
that I think it's directly related to the ignoring of the deficit that we have in
sure.
both Republicans, and I mean I think you've seen that if you're a Democrat, you pass stimulus bill. If you're a Republican, you pass a tax cut bill, and neither's really, those few people that were deficit hawks are kind of done in parties. Also, the war on Iraq driving that up, and various
Oh yeah, and if you actually talk
so
about trying to compensate for the revenue lost on the Iraq War, then you're having more of a conversation about the price tag of the Iraq War.
yeah, and I think that because both parties don't see advantage in talking much about the deficit, we don't. And so, but that wasn't true in 93. And Clinton got caught up. And James Carville's famous quote is that he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because it was driving everything the administration had to do. And Clinton didn't get a great economy in the beginning part of 93. There was something like his first quarter, he gets 0.07 growth. So that really affects how sloppy he looked in the beginning and also some mistakes he makes. A lot of people were saying Clinton's not going to get reelected. So lining up, I don't think president creates jobs. I think that's a big difference that I have with a lot of mainstream politics. But looking at history, it seems like the economy goes up and down and the president does their thing. And we link it, voters link it, pundits link it, newspaper writers link it, and some things are true. If you have a tariff policy and it's going to directly affect one industry slightly or another, yes,
If
that
your
part I
government's not
understand.
doing a good job responding on the pandemic, yes, that will create a loss of jobs. But yeah, no, to your point, I don't think like the president when this president or even previous presidents, but Trump was very sort of upfront about this when he would talk about, oh, I created all these jobs. It's like no, you definitely did not do it with your bare hands. It's like
Well,
under your watch.
I had a great experience where I put out an episode that I had previously done during the Obama administration about how the president does not create jobs. And it went into how, when Kennedy was president, they had a sign on every desk in the White House. What have you done to help create jobs today? That was his entire goal of his domestic policy. And he did institute like a kind of tax cut that was supposed to be stimulative. And it's not that these actions are meaningless. I just think the economy is so much bigger than the presidential actions, and they can do so little to influence them. And the largest presidential actions occur when there's been a Great Depression and the president's actions are nothing more than palliative. So, they seem great, like the New Deal seems great, but when you look at how much the economy had gone down, and it's not a president sort of creating jobs, they're just sort of doing some palliative measures to give a few people jobs where there's mass unemployment, And you could definitely argue that FDR created jobs in quotes by just buying them outright, right? Just
Well, no,
giving you a
but where he
CWA.
really created
But
jobs is
mhm.
he increased demand and liquidity into the market by like creating all these government programs, like food programs, social security, things that were actually getting money to people so that those people could consume and create jobs in their local economy by being customers of those
Yeah.
local businesses. Like that, I think the public works administration, the people going out and building the sidewalks, I think you need that for optics. But when you want to talk about how the president or like how politicians can create jobs, they create jobs by ensuring consumers have more money in their pockets to consume more. And then those
Keeping the
consumers
country
create,
peaceful, keeping it peaceful,
yeah,
regulating markets and things well so that there's not such a big advantage by
volatility.
one.
Yeah.
Running the country well is about as good as you get. So I had the experience of I did a podcast on the president doesn't create jobs. I did that during the Obama administration. I re-released it before Trump was elected. He was starting to already talk about how in Indiana and Pence's home state, there were already like new manufacturing jobs. And we all knew like that they ended up having to pay for each of those jobs a lot and various things. And I don't believe there's been a significant increase really in manufacturing over this administration, but that was a trend that was happening anyway. And any president would deserve that slack. Like, hey, we were losing jobs anyway, except that when you base your whole argument on that. So when I re-released the cast about president doesn't create jobs in late 2016 before he took office, I had a couple of nasty notes and one person unsubscribed because it was like this was what it was based on. Lo and behold, we get to 2020 and I have a listener asking me, could I please have that episode again? Because wanted to prove to their friends that the president doesn't create jobs. It's not his fault. So it's funny, like with history, the way, and again, it just goes to my point. The political actors do this and the economy does this and this and this. And I really think that's the way to look at it. Now, it's not just the economy that determines presidential elections, but it is a big factor, and it can happen. A bad economy could happen at almost any time. So it's something that, hey, look, I mean, every president worries about it. It's also their performance. It's also whether they keep their administration free from a well understood, I would say, bipartisan scandal, like well understood scandal, not just one party throwing mud at you, which is always going to be the case, but something that a broad group of Americans consider to be reprehensible, or to use that overused word, deplorable conduct, and then to keep the country at peace, or if in war, to have great success, and probably to put your mark on Congress, to manage Congress well. And so you saw failures in 2020 on a lot of these fronts.
Yeah,
The
on a
one thing
number.
that I will say he was enormously successful with, which is just as important as all these things, is keeping your party in lockstep. A good president, you know, keeps the can move Congress, and the way they move Congress is by having enough people in their party in Congress and having influence on those people. If either of those things aren't present, they don't have enough of their, like if you didn't have enough Republicans, or if the Republicans said, we're not going to listen to you, Trump, that would be a bad thing. He pretty much had that. He didn't have any significant primary challenger. It helped that they canceled some primaries.
No,
But
he spent a lot of energy over the last 4 years after establishing a power base in the Republican Party, making sure that loyalty to him was a near top priority. Often, as his critics point out, to a fault. But the trade-off of that is right now Donald Trump has a much better chance of challenging for reelection in 2024 here and trying to run one more time because he's got such a hold on the party. I think if he had not been as forceful about securing his base around him and securing party loyalty around him, and if he had allowed for a little bit more, Donald Trump says that, Donald Trump says that. Trump never allowed for any of that. You said something bad about Trump. Mia Love showed him no love, and now she's out of Congress, if you remember that line.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
No, any sort of, I mean, scorched.
He fights. I think that's what people said about General Grant during the Civil War in an entirely different context, though. What Republicans said about him, that they liked about him, and Lincoln liked about him, he fights. And if you ask what partisans will tell you about him, is they felt that people like McCain, and this is entirely from their point of view, not mine, people like McCain or people like Romney didn't fight.
There
And he
is
fought.
I have talked to a number of Republicans since I've been doing the podcast for 10 years now, who have said to me on multiple occasions that one of the point where they became very fed up with the party and how the party was going was McCain, his 2008 campaign, and in particular, the concession speech. And you can read into that what you need to read into that,
Mhm.
as you will. But I think there's a real clear line of not that Tea Party. And you can see the pivot and you can see the inflection, and then Trump kind of becomes a little more obvious if you realize that McCain was such a point of ire for many Republicans.
And then you get to the 70 million argument, which you're hearing a lot of. And by the time the votes are counted, it could be 71 or 72 we're talking about. But
Yeah, I think Trump's
Biden will have 4 million more.
yeah, right. And Biden has
um,
75 or 76 million.
yeah, he'll have anywhere from 4 to 6 million more, depending on
Yeah.
how the count comes out. Because all states have votes out, even New Jersey has votes out. So it's that is the argument going in, and his percentage vote totals, where he was high in a lot of these states, that the intra-party argument at least is he's your top contender for the nomination, assuming that it's something he wants to do. If not, he and his supporter group will still be the largest influencer in the party, because they're going to argue like, look, this was a quirk election where you lost because of COVID. Look at the Republicans gaining
And
seats in
he's
the
gonna make
House.
that argument. He's gonna make that argument really forcefully, and
Hmm.
I am having a hard time conceiving who's gonna be on the other side of that argument going, "No, no, 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 no. You lost because you did not do a very good job governing, sir, Mr. Trump, sir." I like and then also winning over Trump's partisans by force of argument.
It's always hard in party primaries too if you have a former president. I know in '84 this was a big deal who would get Carter's endorsement, and since his vice president Mondale ended up running in that primary, it was hard. I mean, Gary Hart would not come out and attack Carter. John Glenn didn't want to come out and attack Carter, but Carter was backing Mondale. So it's definitely, if the president decides not to run, there's a lot of dynamics that play out, and you have to be clever and cute and use things like modernizing the party and doing, reaching out to new people. What's going to be
But to your
attractive to
point, the preferred candidate of it, like in the case of Carter, like Carter's ghost hangs over that entire primary, and you have to expect with history as a guidepost here, and then also like what we know in recent history and news as a guidepost here, and what we know about Donald Trump and his character and his sense of media presence and the need to be media forward. His ghost will hang over this primary if he chooses not to run. And if he chooses to run, it will be very hard to move him aside. Because I think the argument it would be required to move him aside is, let's say, too real of an argument for people.
You'll have to have another movement by 20. It'll have to be apparent and visible by 2022. If it's
Yeah.
not, that's when you knew. That's when you knew in '98 that George W. Bush was going to be a leading contender for the Republican nomination. That's the point that you know. You knew Obama, pretty much in 2006. Um, you started to hear.
He was in a big field, and they really wanted to make Hillary Clinton happen that year. But they knew.
Hillary Clinton even took some time to decide her as well. That's a little unknown thing. I mean, to the extent we believe, like John Heilman, and all, and the Game Change books. But Clinton had a little decision there. It wasn't like automatic either. But I think that in '84 it was a little more. It was a little different. Like Reagan seemed very strong in '84, but there was a bad economy in '92, in '82, and '83, really bad recession in '82. People forget that it was the great blue collar recession. Like these jobs are going, boy, they're not coming back. In the Springsteen song, because it hit blue collar much more than white collar in that year, and it did. A lot of it was factories closing and permanently, so it had a real impact. So it wasn't so clear. And then his moves with the Soviets were disastrous in the beginning of his term. So there's like this little bit of a bubble there for Democrats, and you had Glenn and other people. He had a reasonable shot. Carter didn't look as bad until you really get to '84 itself, and the economy is really juiced in that election year. And GDP growth of 7%. Reagan's
Right,
gonna
yeah,
win that.
no, I no, right. Why would you change horse in midstream if the economy's going that good?
So
And
you're going to have to see, someone's going to have to emerge. It's going to be a big internet thing if this even happens. And I'm
yeah,
not
no, and
giving.
to your point, I think we will know if I mean, one, Trump will make it manifest whether or not he wants to run again. So we'll know if we're on the Trump hangs over the primary and kind of like, plays kingmaker if Trump's running again. But I think the other kind of clear indicator is that the party's going to break away from Trump. Again, I see that as a low likelihood. It would happen because they start challenging QAnon. So, how forcefully are they going to go after the QAnon conspiracy and supporters of QAnon? Is how much will Marjorie Taylor Greene, the new congresswoman who got elected, who's a QAnon supporter, like how far will she be tolerated? We're already seeing people like Dan Crenshaw criticize Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Mhm.
So does that trend line continue, or do we get a little more cubivalent in the Republican Party? And you go, oh, I don't
My
believe
my
that.
reasonable prediction, and everything's subject to change, and some new name that we still have time for, some new name we're not aware of, but that person's going to have to attract traction. But my reasonable prediction is all you do is you maintain that Crenshaw distance that he's doing is probably where bulk of the party goes. It's not QAnon being the entire 70 million. but it's you're able to comfortably attack the extravagances of that group while not totally running against them
You're not
24
abandoning
hours a
them
day.
either. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what's gonna. But the main argument here, if he lost by, if we were talking about 60 million, 65 million, we were talking about 40%. You're talking about it's done. If you're talking about Republicans up and down that ballot going down because they sided with him, you're talking about a very different thing. And we don't have that. What we have is almost a surgical strike. Take out the president. I'm going to vote for against them. And then in a lot of look at Maine. I looked at the vote totals. Like there's a lot of blue around the coast, and then inland. When you're talking about Joe Biden, when you look at Sarah Gideon, it's just the real coastal towns are blue. See, this is not what happens in a landslide election where there's absolute repudiation. It's just kind of like, so I think
Well, it's that old line of like, oh, the political strategist line of like, oh, I like Trump, but I hate the tweets. Or I
yeah.
like Trump's vision of stuff, but I just don't like that he says it in such a way that he does.
Well, I think, be aware of all these things. As I know, an astute political observer like yourself will be. Beware of the people who are definitely look out for the people who are saluting Trump so much to give themselves enough of a pedestal with Trump supporters to be able to point out why they have differences and then run themselves. That there's going to be a lot of that. Like this was kind of like Clinton did all through the 80s as a boy governor. All right, well, Democratic Party needs to move on. Reagan wasn't wrong on everything. This
Right,
kind of stuff.
right.
He
Yeah,
reached
yeah.
out to people. We as Democrats have to convince people they can trust us again with their money. And so you're gonna see people kind of wedging those things, and also there's going to be people who are absolute supporters, but beware that some of those people are going to do it because they're expecting that a former President Trump will say at some point, I'm not running, and they'll be number one with the supporters for their loyalty. What happens when this happened with FDR in 1940, where he knew he did it deliberately? He put out some feelers. I'm not going to run again. He actually signs with Literary Digest magazine that he's going to write a newspaper column. He's going to write articles for them as a former president. He keeps talking to people about how he wants to go back up to New Hyde, and he doesn't want to be president anymore. All the while planning his reelection, but he has to be careful about a third term. His postmaster James Farley wants to run himself. He wants to replace. So he supports FDR all the way to the convention, and then is bitterly upset because Farley wanted that nomination. There's going to be a few of those folks too. And then there's going to be some people who are just going to try a total run against Trump. And then you're going to have John Kasich, who will get 12% of the vote in Ohio primary. And
man, I think him and Flake and a lot of those guys are just trying to work as Biden's Republican friends in the administration. I think that's what their track is. They think, and I don't think they're wrong. They think that they've got a decent chance of getting confirmed by the Republican Senate. You can get a couple of votes. They can get into the administration and get them way closer to power and way closer to the executive branch than they'd ever get otherwise, especially if they had to face an election. And I also think that Kasich realizes that when he ran against Trump and made himself the anti-Trump in 2016, and he lost out and got really kind of hammered in there, his time in the party was done. That people don't want, the Republican voters don't want a uniter right now. That might change. And we're seeing that in the exit polls too. The Republicans overwhelmingly, they say that they want a strong leader. They don't want someone who can unite the country. Now that might change. They might want the great uniter at some point. There have been times they've liked Bush because he was talking about compassionate conservatism. Reagan kind of was throwing down a little bit of the great uniter vibes. But right now they want a gladiator.
and they'll like us when we win.
Be able to. John Kasich and Jeff Flake are not gladiators.
No, they're done. And I think you're right. I think the very presence of Republicans for Biden, the very presence of them, is an anathema to what's left in the Republican infrastructure, and they won't put up with it. You might get a sort of middling thing. You might get, as you referenced, hey, we're not those QAnon people, but everything, and then the minute Trump decides not to run, if that's his choice, wait for the salutes. Then he was the greatest thing ever, and he fought the good fight. And I just hope I can live up to it. Is
And we
what
got to
every
carry on his message. And I want to be
well, the son is already Trump Jr. is already out there saying that he's watching what people do for his dad, and anyone who wants to be a 2024 candidate should watch what they say right now. So you're
Oh,
seing
man.
that kind of signal.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't know whether he did it off the cuff,
unlikely
but
they get away from the specter of Trump because like I don't, whatever reason, Donald Trump Sr. is no longer on the media scene. Don Jr. is still going to be out there and vociferous, and he'll either have to be marginalized to irrelevance, which is not an impossible thing to foresee, or he is going to have a really outsized influence in the commentariat, and he will.
Watch what state he moves to, because they could run him for Senate anywhere.
Also true.
And he'll
Or
have the
Ivanka.
guarantee.
I think Ivanka could definitely win Senate.
Depending on what I don't know what states. I think right now they're living in D.C., which is no good. But
no, she'll have to relocate. But once
they should have hoped that the Democrats won the Senate and D.C. statehood, and then they have at least something to run for, But that's not going to happen. No, but I think this is all. I think you're absolutely right. Look, if you're Occam's razor here is exactly what we're both saying, which is the new Republican Party they got to go in the Trump election. It's very difficult to make anything else. If something else happens, maybe there's a businessman out here who's well financed, can attract Republicans, has a different plan. But as far as I can see here, we don't have conventions anymore like the old kind where somebody can win in 2 days. You have to sustain a movement over primaries, and
I'm not even sure how Trump's changed the primary rules, but you have to imagine that like the primary rules, like like they changed a lot of stuff in the Republican primaries this time around, to allay and avoid a primary.
Republican delegates are picked based on how the party performed and if they have a governor and things like that. So you're going to see outsized influence of Florida and Ohio.
Yeah, and in the case of Florida, Trump's closeness with DeSantis, the fact that they're so simpatico, only kind of furthers this. Probably even helps Don Jr. if he wanted to run. Yeah, I think if Trump had gotten 2 terms for the Republicans, speaking entirely for the Republicans here, it's a much easier path ahead where you go, we continue on the message of Donald Trump. Thank you so much for your service, sir. On you go. But now Trump's not just going to go away unless he's somehow incentivized to go elsewhere.
Right. And I think that that's obvious. And there'll be no more imposing ex-president ever in history. I mean, James Buchanan.
You're talking about breaking norms, right? Like every other president disappears, right? Like, I mean, Democrats been frustrated with how gone Obama has been over the last 4 years.
Yes, I do believe that both. I think there was a bit of slowness that started in his second term and went all the way through the Democratic primary of 2016 into the 2016 election, and pretty much for these 4 years until this election, he's not been that vocal. Someone could argue he's party building behind the scenes. Maybe that's the case. Fundraising, maybe that's the case.
But it's going to be a real stark. America has not seen an ex-president be a massive vocal critic of society because Republican and Democratic presidents alike, no matter how divisive times were, like the Iraq War, like Clinton did not come out and vocally criticize George W. Bush, but for the conventions when it is normatively expected that politicians come out. But Clinton was not a day-to-day critic of George W. Bush. Reagan would be a bad example, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like
Clinton had a relationship with the Bush family, and there were actually talks, I might have to hit you here or there, but I'm not going to come out big time when there was a lot of pressure. Democrats were kind of in a vacuum in 2004 there. There was a lot of pressure for, especially during the 2002 election when they're being called that they're not patriots. And then you get into 2004 and Kerry's being attacked for the same thing. There's a lot of, He definitely did less than he could have, but that's been the norm for presidents so far.
Right, right.
I do believe that the new president coming in is a bigger shiny object even than Trump. There is a little fatigue. I think that's the other story of the election. The act, let's say, got a little old.
Yes.
Is summoning the media attention every time. They were fascinated by their new shiny object from 2015 to about, I'm going to say, the 2018 midterms. Then it became he had to do something really big to get the big news story. And there were a lot of other objects coming at him: impeachment. Anytime Bob Woodward wrote a book, the various, the Mary Trump, but various books and articles coming out, and then COVID, that took news away from him. So his ability to dominate news like that, he still had his bag of tricks and to be able to like say something wild and get some press. But I don't think like that's part of the issue. It'll still be Trump talking, where I think the election results showed that there was some fatigue of that. I think like I've been Okay, so I could say on the positive side, look, this guy got like to 70 million, it might be up to 72 or so, and that's going to be a Republican talking point, no doubt. It was not like a blowout. It's not Herbert Hoover getting 40% or something, but it was, you know, it still reflects most presidents should win re-election, so
Right,
not doing
right.
it is an anomaly. It reflects to me from a point of history, and even my personal feeling on it is that you can't be president and not reach out. You can't spend your presidency not essentially reaching out to people outside of a certain group.
Well, this is where
And
I really think the stimulus checks. I mean, beyond like the kind of more
Mhm.
cynical, like you send out the money and people like money, like yeah, duh, everyone likes money. But the symbolism of showing that he can control McConnell, he can get McConnell to do what he wants to do, and he can work with Nancy Pelosi, and they can do something that's good for the American people and get it out to them. I think Trump's whole pitch to people who are open to Trump's pitch is that he's a great deal maker. And
Mhm.
if he had been able to show that he could have done that, even if you don't think much of his other coronavirus response has been all that confidence inspiring, like on PPEs or whatever, if he'd been able to show that he could do that, I think he wins this election. I think he easily overcomes
The
what
one
I
of
call
the
libertarian margins, and he's fine.
one of the best moments for his presidency, or best days, was the Chuck and Nancy day when he had, the he had run afoul of the Republican Congress on something, and he called in Chuck and Nancy, and they were working on business. Except that he didn't
He's using
apparently.
them as a prop though, but it was a
Yeah,
good example of him at least experimenting around with the idea of figuring out ways to whip the Republicans into line rather than just to be afraid of reprisal from him.
a successful president has to, in addition to you know communicating out to all the American people, and you don't have to do it. You don't have to be a Biden and constantly say it, like either. And by the way, like any rhetoric, just by saying it doesn't mean you're gonna do it in your actions, but you do have to do it in your actions. So as a president, you have to start to act the office and make it almost Clinton used to call it triangulation, but it wasn't his invention. It wasn't Dick Morris's invention. It was always there. It's an office that is not part of the congressional
The
Republicans, the
dynamics though,
Senate
the
Republicans.
dynamics are triangular. It's you got the
Hmm.
executive, you've got the congressional, you've got the Supreme Court, and they have this interplay with one another, and they check and balance each other, and like it, it's very clear that the founding fathers didn't want A checking B. They wanted rock, paper, and scissors. That their concept of the way you actually have power checking is not odds and evens. It's rock, paper, scissors. And you could say, all right, that's maybe to a fault, or or whatever it is. But I think that's a guiding
They
logic.
absolutely. There's no. I mean, 1,000 people have said it, and it doesn't make it any less true. There's no other way to read any of those papers. To Madison, Washington, mostly relying on Hamilton or Madison's opinions on this. So many others, the various ratification conventions, so much concern about the corruption of men, and how do you? The only way to get around that is to have people watching each other, and yes, sometimes to a fault, sometimes the slowness of government. It doesn't reflect the entirety of opinion. Like if you have a Thomas Paine, he just wanted one big Congress. He didn't want a president. Ben Franklin had ideas like this too, where like in Pennsylvania, they ran things through a plural executive, not a singular one. So you would have, Mr. President, Mrs. President, Mr. President, Mrs. President, Mr. President two, Mr. President three. Like you would have a council essentially running things. So there's other ways to do it, but this is what they came up with in the end. Not everybody was happy with it, but you see in there a lot of the checks. And one of the when it comes to parties, which it's common to say the founders didn't envision them, but they were around, and they were certainly in Great Britain.
They
So,
were aware of they talked about not having factions because they were
mhm.
very much aware of the idea of factionality, and like also it's kind of easy to assume how factions get formed. You have a certain shared basket of ideological idea, like
Mhm.
it's just so natural. It's
I
like
think the parties were always bigger than the factions that Hamilton warned of. The factions
sure.
were like there could be just somebody for one single issue, and of course we have that in our politics. And everything in the Constitution is designed to get things to be big, broad decisions, to have a Senate, to have things to get away from that. But parties of a broad nature that are big tent parties that change over time, like that was really not possible for them to get rid of. They just didn't write it into the Constitution. That would be kind of foolish. It actually is in the 12th Amendment. It's not written as parties, but if you have to select, if a presidential candidate has to select someone to be the vice presidential candidate, the 12th Amendment actually helps parties. So parties were there, and a good president learns to work with the other party. Now, a lot of people will say FDR, LBJ. Here's two examples of very forceful executives. Reagan's going to be your Republican example,
Yeah,
like a
Reagan.
forceful. Eisenhower is going to be your Republican example there. But if you take FDR, it's common to say, well, there's an example of just a Democrat administration, like New Deal. No, I mean, he has George Norris of Nebraska, significant Hiram Johnson of California, significant progressives. Some of the people who, if they were old enough, had supported Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. Now,
That also gets to the weird shift between the Democratic and the Republican parties,
mhm,
which over post the Civil War. I mean, go to the Civil War, the Democratic Party are the
conservative,
they're
muttering
the party
things
of the
about the
South.
Constitution. And,
Yeah,
yeah.
and over especially in the early 20th century, that's where you really start to see that like cloud of like the parties and their ideologies cross over one another, and I think it makes it a little bit more doable then than now too.
I mean, FDR needed Republicans. Henry Wallace was his vice president, but first his Secretary of Agriculture. Former, father was a Republican, came from a Republican family. He needed Republicans to pass things. Democrats in the South were against it eventually turned against some of Roosevelt's work. He needed, LBJ needed Republicans to pass civil rights. Everett Dirksen, the minority leader of the Republicans, crucial Senate votes for the Civil Rights Act. He used Republicans where he could. As a president, you have to manage Congress one way or the other, and not just kind of wallow in partisanship and not reach out too much. And I think that's probably to me the lesson here. The other lesson here is that American voters are fickle. Votes don't mean love. That's true of Trump. It's true of Biden's votes. The votes don't mean love. They mean votes. That's it. Guy went into a voting booth, or a woman went into a voting booth, picked among two names that could reasonably be president, and made a call. Love ain't got it. Love has to do with 30% of those voters. They got a poster on the wall. The other 70% that voted for you, no love.
Yeah,
Just get this done.
it's a transaction. It's about like economic stuff. Maybe it's about social issues for some like Trump voters. For a lot of Democratic voters, a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden. It wasn't about voting for Joe Biden. It was about voting for the Democratic Party's vision of COVID-19 response over the Republican Party's vision of COVID-19 response.
Like for FDR, there were a lot of Democrats who were like that silly chameleon with the Christian Science smile. It's not going to get it's not going to get anywhere. But you know what? I don't want to vote for Herbert Hoover. So there's definitely like, this is the way we need to look. And people can decide not to ignore that at their own peril. I do believe too, another definite message of this election as somewhat narrow. I think it's actually going to open up a bit. Somewhat narrow as the result is as we're recording it. It does reflect that people have to consider. You're hearing a lot about, well, we're a divided country and stuff like that. Yeah, but you also have to consider that the country is different from your perception. Like, for instance, Georgia's a rural state. No, it's not. It's an urban one. It's a suburban one.
It's a southern state,
Texas is a
and what's going on there is a little bit of north-south bias, where the north still thinks the south is underdeveloped,
Mhm. Mhm.
undercultured, under urbanized, under industrialized. I mean, I do think, okay, so I think we are a polarized country in the sense that the two political parties, as we were kind of discussing, just because of like the evolution of the country post the Civil War, post slavery, and post civil rights, really moved those two parties. It sorted those two parties. It sorted out regions to a large extent too. Regionality became more of a component. Um, and I do think we are more polarized. I don't. I think that's just like kind of the lay of the land for right now too. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Well, remember, I always warn people of this when they talk about polarization. It's like, remember the expense of not being polarized, like the expense in quotes of not having New York always vote Democratic, California always vote Democratic, is you're going to be living in a state that's, let's say you're a Democratic voter, you're going to be living in a blue state with a Republican senator, and you're not going to like it.
Right. Right.
You're gonna be happy when the total picture in the Senate might be a mix of things, and once in a while you can get your California Republican senator to vote for a minimum wage or Social Security or something like that. But generally, you're not going to like it. My point being, polarization is a little more popular than what people think.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do believe people have to be realistic. One of the things I think happened in 2018, I think it happened in 2020, is that the concept of what is left liberal got enlarged. And in other words, I think Republicans, um,
Oh, I also think that happened with the right too, because with the departure of the Lincoln Project and all those guys. So you
mhm,
think about all those groups, those are now people who are decidedly conservative people. At best, you might call them right centrists, but
mhm,
they are now insufficiently right for the Republican Party.
right. Tom Nichols said something like on Twitter, I can't wait to start fighting with you people again over taxes or whatever. And I think given, some of the
Could be a
things
do
that
without a
Trump
party,
said
I
that
would suspect.
particularly were scary, or actions that he took regarding the post office during the election, or whether he's joking or not, making statements about maybe I'll keep running even for a third term or something, things like that are scary for someone like me who studies history. Very, in the face of that, like, you kind of want to say, well, I'm happy to argue about capital gains cuts with you. Um, but that day will come. Yeah, these guys, that's not the interest. It's a much more total package. It's a more concept of a person that Republicans were looking for, and what Trump provided for them. Fighter would be a key. I don't like the tweets. That's very common to hear. I don't like some of the statements. Well, they're not always listening to every statement day to day, the way on the left media is actually tracking all of the
Right, 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 right.
statements. So there's a lot of that. Like, oh, did he say that? I didn't even hear that. You can't take him seriously on everything. The kind of like making a statement, then giving you the ability to say you're joking. Something, by the way, Reagan was common. He goes out and says Dukakis is crazy, and then comes back and says, "Oh, I was just joking." Well, he calls him an invalid and then says that he's just joking. I mean, they're
No,
they're
it is really interesting too. I think you identified something where it's like people people in the out party pay more attention to the news than people in the in party, and so like what I expect will happen to some extent with Biden. I actually expect it to be a little bit less than usual, but I expect some degree of Democratic voters wanting to turn off and not have to worry about the news for a while. Like I certainly felt the sense of relief not having to have
yeah,
cable news on anymore after this last week. And I imagine there'll be a little bit of a push to that, but then I think also the situation, COVID-19 in six
mhm.
figure daily cases. Like there are so many real things driving us back to the TV, that I do think you'll see some following. But yeah, it's so normal that like when your guys in power, you want to go like, well, things are probably okay now. And a little bit of ignorance is bliss kicks in too.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we think about a lot of these concepts are abstract. So Joe
Yeah.
Biden can go to in Delaware and make a speech about reaching the hand out and I'm going to govern for all people and things like that. Democrats like words. We know this. We love our Kennedys, our Ted Kennedys. We love the magic the words, the speeches. Some people even sing song like Kennedy did. Make the broad speeches in that way that like that's coming from a style from 19th century. Kennedy's an admirer of Winston Churchill and other
I
speakers from
think I
that.
disagree with
So
you.
we're borrowing. We love that kind of
Yeah.
speaking. Now, Republican voters, not all of them, but to
No,
some
if
degree,
anything, Obama has turned a lot of them against speechification. They don't like the bit they think after watching Obama, that a person who can deliver a good inspirational speech might be a little bit of a snake oil salesman. You go back to Reagan, they were into it, but yeah,
the funny thing is that Obama did that a lot in the campaign, and then as president was more the exact opposite. He made very like plain English speaking, like plain. Let me be clear. Let me be clear. I've been working on that one.
yeah.
Don't boo, vote.
No, my big
Don't
thing
boo.
is long.
I didn't know when we were exactly allowed to do anything but vote. He just kept coming out. My favorite is like, don't tweet, vote. Like, well, well, wait, we got 4 years before we're allowed to vote. So what do you? I want to tweet a little,
Yeah,
but
right. We need to have some sort of feedback loop here going. So you can know what's going on.
but I think that main point being, well, when you start to look at the 70 million question and what was it? Why are we polarized? There's got to be a reason. And you're very right to point to these historic sectional differences. It's never changed. It's part of American. As much as people think when you invent a smartphone, instead of like a horse and carriage and a plow, that we're going to be different. I don't know. I mean, that sectional difference, North and South, is just kind of embedded in America, even as you expand out west, because it's where your family came from, and people may not state it directly, but it's definitely those two philosophies, where it's one's more like collective thinking, and the other one is more like
Yeah, yeah,
individualistic,
right.
and there's various grades that we're willing to tolerate of each. So when you think about that, it's like, what's that 70 million really? I think, well, I don't. It's like, A, this guy fights, and then B, I don't trust them. They can reach out to me all they want, but the way you reach out to me is like, I don't know. You say you're better at managing COVID, manage it. And don't tell me to and then there's going to be certain things that restrictions on their liberty and stuff like that, they're not going to like. But generally, they're going to like a good performance. And you're going to see people come to you with that. Rhetoric is just kind of the icing on the cake. And I think sometimes the tendency for Democrats to put everything into it because our heroes were good at it, really good at it. Reagan was pretty good at it too. But he would have lost if that 82 recession continued and he had a bad economy in 84, no matter how, good of an actor and a silver tongue that he had. And some of his speeches did fail. In fact, like his second major budget speech absolutely failed. And people in Congress are like, okay, well, it's over after 1 year. So
I mean,
so
the arms for hostages speech was, like lampooned. Like it
yeah.
was so even though my heart tells me that I didn't trade arms for hostages, the facts and the evidence tell me otherwise. Like, all right.
Yeah, I think so if I could sit here and have Republicans and Democrats together, I'd say look, you Democrats, you got to start thinking about action. You got to start thinking about the individual. Very important. You got to think about a guy driving a car,
I think
and
you get
that
rewarded
is
for strong
America.
performance. Like that's the big thing that Democrats need to be thinking about. And I mean, on the flip side of this, for Republicans, the teachable lesson with Trump, I think, is okay. This is not my preferred policies, to be clear here. You champion the Trump policies, but you actually try to be nicer and actually try to talk nicer. You don't actually have to change a whole lot in terms of the policies. Your voters would probably appreciate if you changed as little as possible. But what has to change is the level of politeness and the level of the level of rhetoric, because if anything, the Democrats maybe care too much about rhetoric. The Republicans have not cared enough about how their rhetoric turns people off.
And not good
And they'd
bedside
be in a much
manner.
better position if they talked in a
I
much
mean,
better.
yeah, bedside manner to be obvious with the current president. And also, so my advice to Republicans would be there's a thing called suburbs. Um, so suburbs exist. Like it was the entire focus of Bill Clinton's political life that there are suburbs. There are people who moved from the city and they didn't move into the country. They moved to a suburb, and that's where the votes are. And I think in a lot of the Republican strategy, it's like that's left. That's just the leftists. So writing off entire blue communities like is just those are the cities and those people. When most people are in suburbs, they're not actually in a city. Some of them never go into an actual city except for like theater or for some other thing once in a while, but live near one in suburbs. And going back to Kennedy, I was actually looking at a talk that he had before his assassination, and he was planning the '64 election. And that was one thing they're first noticing is Democrats are moving to suburbs, and we have to start tailoring our campaign to that. That's 1963. So the fact that in 2020 we're just talking about like red counties and trying to amp out the exurb vote versus thinking about suburbs and what people care about there.
Yeah.
Treating the entire populated country as just the coasts or just the cities in quotes, or that everybody's like a Portland protester or everybody's like an extreme person with doing some of the most annoying stuff that leftists do, let's just say. You're writing off millions of votes, and you'll be in this situation if you continue that.
Hey,
On the other hand,
you gotta find a tonal balance on the other hand of like,
yep.
How do you talk in a way that appeals to people in the suburbs while not talking in a way that loses the people in the country? And like right now, the country base of the Republican Party wants to hear a very different sort of style of rhetoric and a different sort of discourse when it comes to the libs than the people in the suburbs, who many of whom employ the libs or have a daughter or a son who is, like it's just, it's different. And I think that's a real tension for the Republican Party going forward here. I was going to say not post-Trump, but like in the MAGA era, in this phase of the MAGA era of the Republican Party. You brought up Grover Cleveland. I never want to let an opportunity to let Chester A. Arthur or Grover Cleveland go by unmentioned on this show here. You brought up Grover Cleveland and the 1884 election, and you said that you thought this election was really similar to 1884. Why is that?
Just you defeat a president with the help of a Democrat defeats a Republican president with the help of Republicans who are more, say, independent minded and certainly against the incumbent president, let's say, in this case, a candidate in 84. Not a huge mandate, kind of a narrow win in the states that you need to, but you're sort of running the table on the swing states you need to. And that's exactly what Grover Cleveland did. He didn't win huge. He wins New York by 1,200 votes. As I referenced earlier, there's a prohibition candidate who gets 25,000, almost all at the expense of Republicans, because Democrats at that time were where, the whiskey drinkers were. They were in both parties. And then some other incidents that occur. They nominate James Blaine, who's really, his corruption is just palpable. I mean, everyone knows it, including the Republicans, and they're just kind of horrified by him. But on the other hand, he's a great partisan. By the way, I mean, Blaine gets a bad rap. You're not going to find a better defender of the rights of African Americans in this country than James Blaine. He's also out there in the West attacking Chinese Americans. So it's, it's definitely a double-edged sword today. And people felt it in the Republican Party in 1884. So a lot of them went for Grover Cleveland. But then as president, he gets elected. Some of his own party doesn't like him because he kind of gave the hand to the big political machine in New York, Tammany Hall, and got elected with Republican votes, but he's a Democrat. So it's this like real mixture of politics. And I kind of also Democratic Party loses seats in the House while Grover Cleveland wins the presidency, suggesting no real coattails. And so I sort of see that. Look, there's no one-to-one comparison.
No, this is such an
never.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, Blaine wasn't an incumbent. There was the incumbent president, Chester Arthur, didn't run. In fact, he hated Blaine, so he didn't help at all.
I mean, I think one of my big takeaways of this election is it's going to be fascinating to analyze, but I also think there'll be this real danger for people to over extrapolate from this very, very unique election with like a unique candidate in Donald Trump, but more importantly, this unique precondition of COVID-19 that really precluded on the ground style campaign in any of the ways that we've seen in the last 16 years and should expect to see in a post COVID era. Like it's this one election with an interruption in ground game.
Interesting. Yeah, I do think that hurt. I think it particularly hurt Democrats.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because Republicans were willing to still do a lot of ground game. Alex Thompson over Politico was reporting that the Republicans were still doing a sizable amount of door knocking campaigns, whereas the Democratic candidates basically didn't have that available to them because they were the party of responsible COVID-19 response. And you can't, I think they were right to assume whatever benefits you might gain from doing ground game could easily be washed away by a negative story of the Democrats causing a COVID outbreak in a community.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think I think the planned gains, that's a thing too. The closeness of the election result. I think you have to think about COVID. You have to think about long lines in particularly where Democrats vote, long lines that people had to endure. That really puts it used to be like, America, you're just so bad, you don't turn out. Well, now you got to think about how hard it is sometimes for people voting. With some of it is the measures that have been imposed, voter suppression measures by various states. Others really do just come down to fundamental system. These things are expensive to run, and counties don't always have well funded. I mean, I happen to be in New Jersey where there's better funding of elections, machines work and things like that. This isn't as easy. So I do think that there's that. I also think it's tough to beat an incumbent. And next year, they won't have an incumbent in the race. The Republicans will not have an incumbent in the race no matter what. So they're going to be hoping for the same thing. Like the way Jimmy Carter beats an incumbent, then he's up for reelection and there's a recession and he loses. And they were hoping that when Reagan came up for re-election in 84, first of all, it's like, oh, this is a weird new type of president. We're going to beat him on that. That nothing's happening with the Soviets. Haven't even met with a single Soviet leader as of 84. We're going to beat them on that. And hopefully they're going to get into a recession. And we're just going to have this chain of presidents. We're on this trend of presidents being defeated. Well, that didn't happen. And then there's not another defeat until 92. So I think obviously it's hard to predict at these times, but that's what Republicans would probably have to get, that same triangle of scandal, economy, and intra-party fighting, which, with a President Biden, or if something were to happen, a President Harris. We didn't talk about Harris much in this election, but I think Georgia, that's probably a lot of the story there. I think she had some interesting choice, historic moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about Harris in Georgia is that, like, given who Joe Biden he signaled that he wanted to have someone like Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams as his VP, and given that, I think, and given the closeness of Georgia right now, I think it probably would have made some sense to go with Abrams, especially because everyone was worried about whatever negatives Abrams or whoever else was going to be the VP might bring to the ticket. That seemed to be completely irrelevant throughout this campaign. The Republicans were very, very focused on Hunter Biden. And they really chose to make Hunter Biden the focus of the negative attacks on Joe Biden. And so Harris's record,
attacking an African-American woman has a backlash possibility
also
too.
true.
So it's hard, but not that they don't, they're totally capable of attacking people, but they have to be a little careful during the time of a national election, So I think that was, could have been, a difficulty there too.
No, I think he helped.
You pick a senator generally because you want somebody to be vice president, going to be president of the Senate, and it's more than just that. It's not just banging a gavel. they need to run the Senate for the president. So it's always a little advantage, little heft that comes with being one of 100 in a club, hearing confidential secrets of the government, running foreign policy or helping to, or having the image of doing it. So you pick a senator. I think, look, I mean, this wasn't a radical new ticket. This was Biden, and he went with
I mean, you already kind of see who Biden's floating for his cabinet here. The guy goes for predictable choices.
yeah.
Kamala Harris was a predictable choice. I think you will see a lot of predictable choices in the White House, like Senator Chris Coons, and others kind of making their way into the White House. And yeah, no, I don't expect, at least not initially, Biden to do a lot of surprises. Now, I think he may come in, realize that he is trapped in a rerun of the first couple of years of the Obama administration and that he needs to shake it up, or else he'll be experiencing the same sort of electoral defeat as Obama did in 2010. He might realize that he needs to shake it up and then change course. But it seems fairly clear from all the tea leaves I'm reading that Biden wants to come in and do the unity thing that he was talking about on the campaign trail, and that he kind of believes that Republicans are going to mentally have to change, or maybe their hearts will adjust in a post-Trump era. And we'll have to just see how that plays out for him.
Yeah, I think that it will be interesting. I think in the other factor that brings up is, like, do you pick a VP candidate for the home state advantage? And I think it's something more that we talk about as pundits, but candidates don't actually do it. And it indicates, because if you do it, it sort of indicates
campaign trail too. Like they will actually bring up, like, well, you can't do that because of the home state thing, and like this person's better. Like the Chris Coonses of the world, and like the campaign advocates will bring that up.
Yeah. I think, like, but generally you're picking a VP. You could do it for Homestead. I mean, there was a lot of talk about Val Demings, and but having looked up, her district, that's a gerrymandered district. I don't think she necessarily brings you Florida. Now I think it's pretty clear you wouldn't get it, because there was such a change in Miami-Dade. Which, again, I think when you talk about incumbency and advantage, I think that Miami-Dade is directly related to that and may not be present in a future election, because
there was talk about Bowser though, and I think like Bowser is a good example. And there's a substantial stylistic difference between Abrams and Bowser and Kamala Harris. I think anyone who's just looking at stuff on a surface level is really missing that there's a tonal and just a complete stylistic difference between those two types of candidates. And I think Bowser and Abrams appeal to different people than Harris necessarily does.
Harris, yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll find out later in books. We'll have to get Heilman and to do another campaign book.
Well, she's a really interesting study in political rise. I mean, like she's arrived in the vice presidency. She's a historic figure, and she also kind of got there without having to win big elections or hard elections per se. She got there
absolutely.
She got there primarily by doing the finessing and finagling. Like we were talking, I was doing some work for you on your other show, Vices, on Charles Fairbanks, and like he's a really interesting like you would not think of these two people as analogous, but like Fairbanks really got to where he was by like finessing the party, not necessarily winning votes, not necessarily winning hearts over, but the money was in the right places. He had the right friends. He knew how to kind of get into here, get into there. And I see a lot of the same stuff with Harris, where she's not this electoral juggernaut. She's not this master of debate like an Elizabeth Warren or like even a Barack Obama. She doesn't bring any of that stuff as a candidate, but she's got this unique ability to feel the energy of the room inside of her party that could make her a very effective party leader.
And I think that as something as, she's opposite from who I am as an identity, right? I mean, I'm a white male, and Carlson, I got grandfather's the big Swede and all that. I don't get much beyond, Northern Europe there and everything. So I have to always be cautious in my own assessments. And I did but everyone can kind of see things outside their own a little. And one thing I detect is like my first reaction to the vice presidential debate, so important because as a vice presidential candidate, you do kind of like a couple of things. You How big of a splash on your announcement, how you perform in the VP debate, and home state. Home state negligible in this case. Now, VP debate, my initial performance, my initial assessment is, and she didn't do that good. Pence actually had a pretty good debate, won a lot of points. And in the traditional debate, I think that's absolutely true. But I also noticed her ability to speak non-verbally and to send messages that I believe women pick up on, looks. Like, how could you possibly say that thing?
Oh, and she would
Um,
evoke looks out of Pence
mhm,
too. Like
mhm.
she did. You're right. It's like weird because like in a weird way, I kind of thought she was losing that debate with the words and winning that debate outright with the faces.
And
Like
how much she humanized
yeah,
Joe Biden. Like Joe Biden was very, in the primaries was very like stiff, and there was a lot of concerns about him. And Harris had a way of humanizing him. So these are the positive traits. I think she has some work to do, like any new VP would. A new person to the national scene you reference. She hasn't been in the national scene that long. None of the potential candidates really, except maybe Klobuchar, would have been. So that's not a huge deal. Has to work on a few things. I think learning to speak as a president would. You're now governing is a little
which is
different
kind of
than
a
a
heck of
than a
the on the
senator.
job training now for that.
But she has a way of reaching a common point with the base, and if you look at women, black voters, particularly black women voters, I mean, she's definitely your base and kind of like a humanizing figure. Where sometimes Joe Biden can be that same guy he was in 1988, speaking the same
Yeah,
way.
yeah, oh
Go
yeah.
listen
No,
to
no.
his announcement; it sounds the same as the Wilmington speech last night.
I mean, you read the tweets. Like, yes, on one hand, it's going to be nice to have more normal tweets, but like the tweets are almost like painfully normal the other way. Like,
Yeah, we're going to definitely get the other side of this. He was, funny enough, you're talking about the youngest senator at the time, one of the youngest elected senators ever, elected before he could legally enter the Senate. Um, but not, obviously, when it came to his swearing in, he was 30. But he was 29 when elected to the oldest president. So it is interesting there. He's had quite a career. He's also a person, though. I don't think a lot of people know this about him, but he's also a person who hasn't faced tough elections. I don't necessarily consider this one so tough. I think,
well, no, I don't think
yeah,
he really got particularly challenged in the
yeah,
primaries. And if you're a believer to a certain extent, in like the party decides theory of like the way primaries work, like the party will have like leadership in the party will have a real preference of who they want to come out
mm,
of this. Joe Biden was definitely that, and definitely the beneficiary of that throughout. To your point, because of COVID-19, the expectations, at least from his own party, of the amount of visibility that he was going to have, way lower. A lot of myself included, cheering him on for staying in the bunker and not doing availabilities and keeping a low profile and doing very little. Like, I agree with you. I think that he, him and Kamala Harris, it's very interesting how
well, he's never had a tough
yeah
election then
yeah
because it's
right.
been his first one was tough in 1972 with McGovern running. He wins Delaware while Nixon does too, overwhelmingly.
Interesting.
He just ekes out, and essentially in Delaware you can have a local election. It's like running for a council seat or something because you can reach all the voters, which he literally can. I have enough tea with voters in enough places, and of course a little bit of get your friends to vote for me too, and he wins that state in just a surprising election
He's
and not in
really
a
good
wave
at
at
that.
all.
He's always been really good at the micro politics thing, and so like he's actually
It comes
perfect.
from a small place.
Yep, he
He
comes from a
comes from
small
it. It's
place.
also one of the reason I think he makes his goofball mistakes because he's a local politics type guy. And if you're at the Legion Hall, you slap on the back, you hug the person, you're very personal, you say funny, witty things like little jokes and stuff. On the national stage doesn't always work, but he could keep Delaware. He only had one tough race. It was that the election right after his first race, which was tough, was the 78. He has a tough Senate and this is where the busing issue comes up because he's being challenged on that issue. And that's why he leans a little right on that issue. He actually does save busing in a sense because he actually sponsors the bill. There were Democrats looking to gut busing altogether. He sponsors a bill that at least preserves it if a court orders it. So, but anyway, he has a tough race in 78, then never has a tough race again. Goes home each night to, as we all know now, on the Amtrak.
Right.
I am actually a personal witness to seeing him get off at Wilmington on the Amtrak when I was returning from a business trip once. So, and then
you can do that in some states, and like kind of conversely with Kamala Harris, like you can't go home and do the Joe Biden strategy and slap everyone on the back
no.
in California. It'll never work.
But it did mean, like, a lot of people think, well, he's a big, powerful guy. He was Judiciary Committee. Well, Judiciary actually isn't the big committee. He just happened to get a profile when the Supreme Court cases come up.
It can be high profile because of confirmations or whatever, but like
yes,
on a day-to-day
but
basis,
it's not Ways and Means, which he didn't get.
Right.
And he could have if he played the game. He wasn't there for the dinners at Ebbitt's Grill, at 10 o'clock at night. He was home. So he's a guy that really, it's interesting. When he runs in 1988, he's a maverick. He's going as Bob Shrum recruits him as a Democrat to run on a kind of yuppie vote, to kind of be a new type of Democrat.
Yeah, the new Democrat type, yeah.
And then he kind of, 2008, I don't know what that was. And then we get to
the best thing he did in the 2008 campaign was roast Rudy Giuliani with the noun, a verb, and 9/11 line.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he had his moments. 2012 VP debate handled that very well. I think he does. He does a. He's an efficient operator.
Good job negotiating his way through the 2008 vice presidential debate when it was actually kind of a mirror image of Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, and Joe Biden needed to be really careful to not inadvertently be playing the heel, playing the bad guy for the non-wrestling fans here. No, because Sarah Palin was very much trying to bait him and get him to be positioned as the heel, as the bad guy. And he did a really skilled, he did a fine job, still might be pushing it, but a fine job in not letting himself be that, in the same way that he does he's not like a great debater. He's not a great forceful rebutter, although I thought he did better in the last debate here. But what he's been good at throughout his entire career is like, it's hard to define him. It's hard, like, he is what he is. It's hard for you to come in and define him to be something different than what people understand him to be already. Because what he's understood to be, he's got pluses and minuses built in, and so people kind of think that that's real.
Yeah, I think it's. I think there's a lot of reality there to what he is. I think what you see is what you get to an extent. There may be more behind the surface, like that we don't. There's been a lot of study of him. There's a great book, Ben Kramer. The now I'm forgetting. It's like The Cost of Things, or it's a book about running for president in 1988, and he has about his mindset, how he won that 1972 Senate race. Just like saw the opportunity, like a football player on the field that was going to be there 12 seconds from now, and entered it, and it was too late for his opponents to catch up. And he has this way about him. And he's a very different type of thinker. I do believe had he won the nomination in 88, he would have beaten Bush. I believe he would have been a two-term president. I think that if he was, I do think, he is of an advanced age, even though I think he's okay right now from what I see. Medicine's advanced to where some of these issues that kill
I'm definitely at a point where I joke about, I'm actually serious about it, but the Bob Barker rule, I have sort of a joking title.
It's going to affect energy level. It will affect some politics, because you can't be at every meeting.
It does, man. I wish I had the confidence that in my late 70s, I could go day to day and not have to worry about a heart attack or a stroke or something.
Can't pull the Clinton thing. He's not going to have round the clock meetings like Clinton did. He can't be like, hey, budget meeting negotiations till 2 a.m. Then we fly to California for my 25th appearance in the state of California, because it was a swing state then. You're not going to, so that's going to have some political effects, your ability to do, and there's no doubt. So that leaves a little question mark about 2024. It's a long way away.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure. But no,
got to talk about Texas, man. I mean,
81. Let's talk about Texas. So over the last three election cycles. It went from I'm doing this a little off the top of my head here. I want to say it's in 2012. It was 16%, 16% spread between the Democrats and the Republicans. In 2016, that tightens up to single digits, 9%. So it's a sizable change. This time around, it tightened into about a 5% spread. So Texas is increasingly on the map. If you're asking me how do I feel about Texas right now, I feel like it's up for grabs in 2028 in earnest, and it's earnestly and purely a battleground state at that point. But that said, I think going into 2024, especially given the fact that Ted Cruz is up for re-election and Ted Cruz underperformed in a serious way to Beto O'Rourke the last time around. If Ted Cruz becomes the rock star Senate race for the Democrats, which he should become, and the Democrats really focus a lot on Texas, Texas is within range for the Democrats in 2020.
If you don't have a recession and you have an incumbent president, when people feel good, and you don't have as strong an ideological opposition in that state as you did in 96, you could eke out a win in Texas.
I think it's doable.
It's doable. It may help to get some local offices more. It may help to get the governor. Obviously, if that changes, that can help swing a state.
Yeah, no, the governor candidate last time, Lupe Valdez, running up against Greg Abbott, she was underperformed in a substantial way compared to Beto O'Rourke. So,
yeah.
No, the Democratic Party on a national level needs to help energize the local Democratic Party here in Texas, and I think that's a big part of it. And yeah, no, I think.
But I don't know what happens, because when you're looking at it, if it's up to the Democratic Party, well, they just maybe they learn what might be the wrong lesson, like they won by Pennsylvania now.
No, I really worry that like they look at some of these states. Either one, they think that they got the blue wall back. When in reality the blue wall is a northern battleground. Is the term that they need to be using. That Michigan's a place that you have to fight for, make sure that you hang on to. Wisconsin, I think they were right to have their convention planned out to be in Wisconsin. I think that maybe even helps them a little bit with turnout in Madison, which is where they needed it. You know, they need those like turnouts. But Wisconsin's not a guarantee anymore. Minnesota, they need to keep an eye on at bare minimum. And Georgia, you're winning that by like under 10,000 votes as we're taping this right now. Like, yeah, okay, fight for Georgia, but like, don't plan on Georgia. North Carolina maybe is gettable. Maybe.
I always said, one thing that did annoy me, like during the last 4 years, is when Obama won Indiana and North Carolina in 2008. Nobody, absolutely nobody, talked about a revolution in those states and a new blueness in those states and that they were turning Democratic. It was just simply like, hey, and then we were this whole 4 years. It was said that these like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, you just lost them. They're like red states. Come on. It was a plurality win. It just snapped back. There was no Gary Johnson in the race. And of the Gary Johnson voters, most of them had said that they would vote. It was like not exact, but it was almost like a 2/3 to a third about I would, if I do vote, some of them wouldn't vote. I vote for Hillary Clinton. There was a reason they didn't vote for Trump. Trump was available. They didn't vote for him. So if you didn't like, it was just, you didn't like Hillary, you didn't want to vote for Trump either. You voted for Gary Johnson. That was a good 4% gone. And that's what helped make that blue wall crash. I don't think there was much there any more than when Obama won Indiana. It obviously didn't reflect any kind of sea change because they can't get it again. Georgia may be similar. Clinton won it in 92 by 13,000 votes. He did not win it in 96.
Yeah, I struggle. It's like, okay, so on one hand, you've got a little bit of something that mirrors the Texas miracle in Georgia in the sense that Georgia, the state, has placed a lot of energy in getting more television production out in Georgia, more industry out in Georgia. It's like what you're talking about, the kind of the northern hubris of thinking that like Georgia is this unsophisticated place. Well, people like Ted Turner and stuff, we're trying to bring Georgia into the entertainment and other spectrums. In Georgia, Atlanta does a lot of stuff. So I think it's gettable. I think that the change is real there over the last 25 years. They have a huge non-white population in Georgia. one of the highest in the country. So I think that helps the Democratic.
And suburbs again, like the Cobb County used to be solid, but that was Newt Gingrich's district. I mean, it was Cobb County, and now that's almost a reliable Republican, Democratic county, and the suburbs around Atlanta. Um, and a lot of the country are these suburbs, and this is the story for Democrats as much as the Republicans have a story that they have this weapon of energizing the culture war to their advantage to get turnout up from their turnout bases, which sometimes was staying home for people like your Romneys and your McCain's, and even split on Bush sometimes. I don't think there was certain issues in that old 2004 election, but not the same type of like culture war issues that we have. A little bit, because in some states they did use issues like gay marriage to drive turnout out.
Yeah. There's a little bit of that for sure. I mean, the culture war at that point was like, do you support the government's robust
Mhm.
terrorism response in the airports? And like there was a cultural shift that was happening because of the government's response to terrorism. But it wasn't like a culture war. And also the Democrats on the other side weren't like really pushing that hard against TSA, making you take off your shoes and stuff at the airport. They were kind of basically saying it was okay.
But I mean, the best you could say is you've put this election has put Texas in swing,
Yeah. No, I
and maybe Florida and Ohio aren't.
I'm beginning. I mean, like, so that those are things that we've talked a lot today about a number of different electoral college maps, and I'm sure listeners have been like, "Oh, whoa, California was a battleground state. Oh, there were five."
Mhm.
Like, I think one of the big takeaways from here is that the electoral college map has really changed, and so I will be interested to watch the pundit class going forward and seeing if they're still talking about this the way it was in the aughts and the 2010s. Because yeah, no, I think Pennsylvania, I think, is still a battleground state,
Oh, it
but
absolutely is. Yeah.
I don't. I'm with you. I don't think Ohio is anymore, and I'm
Nah, Mahoning County. You lost Mahoning now. It only went 1 point for Hillary in 2016, and now it just went totally for Trump. And that was an old, that's Youngstown. That's your old industrial area. Cleveland has
and
just
theoretically the people
decimated.
Biden should have brought back. If there was any candidate that was going to bring him back, it was going
Right.
to be a Biden type.
Well, I think they've lost young people. I think that they've lost population in general. There's no economy there. Too many factory closings simply in the areas of Ohio that used to provide those jobs, and those were generally your Democratic voters. They could be conservative Democratic voters. These are the same group of people who absolutely supported the National Guard at Kent State. This is that kind of Democrat, but they're not like a hippie Democrat. They're a
Take care of the work,
union
man,
working Democrat,
Democrat.
but
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
have a job and
they're gone. I mean, they're just depleted. And then the other areas of Ohio, it's too much like like a red state. So I don't know. You might have a possibility, but it doesn't seem like your first target. Florida's, I guess, always a little purplish, but I do.
Florida's winnable. You have to like how much of that is like the mail. I mean, like the Dems lost in Florida, but they didn't lose by like that huge of a margin.
No, I think it was 300,000. It's looking like, or something like that. Actually,
Yeah,
there was improvement in the Panhandle over Hillary Clinton,
yeah. So and
from Biden.
you got to expect.
But you lost Miami-Dade. Oh, well, you didn't lose, but you allowed Trump to gain in Miami-Dade. There is a possibility that that has to do with actions as president and may not be applicable in 4 years. If he was starting to talk about some things around Venezuela or with Cuba and things like that, if you don't have those levers to pull, you may not be. That's something that it might be a one time. I don't know. Jury's out on that. Dick Morris always said, I recall a story where Clinton was like calling him up and saying, I got to invade Haiti. How should I explain it to the American people? And Morris was like, you're invading the wrong goddamn island. And so maybe if you're really, there was always a thought that Madeleine Albright was standing up to Cuba a little. And there was some thought that I believe Clinton wins Florida. I'm going to be on a little limb, but I think in 96 he does win it. If you can kind of split that vote a bit, among, you take a little stand here or there, you take a shot at him. if you
That kind
really
of like
want to do that.
Elian Gonzalez posturing back in the day
Well,
was
that ruined it, but that was Janet Reno's
yeah.
decision, not Clinton,
Yep.
nor Madeleine Albright. And actually, Gore came out against it. Gore came out in favor of keeping Gonzalez with the family, but people still punished him, and because it was the guns going into the house and all of that photo. And I really think that's what turned 2000 a lot. Then again, what policy do you have? Do you really want to continue a policy based on just the politics of Florida, national policy? So it's a difficult question, and these new swing states will have their new particular issues that they bring. There may be a Texas one that I'm
So
not
to
aware
that
of.
point, I mean, a big thing I've been thinking about, in terms of theory of politics stuff and re-examining priors or whatever, is like, as the electoral college map changes, you also have to change the way you govern and the policies you champion to better contour your policies for the electoral college map. So I would say for a Democrat going forward, unless you think you are making an exact play for Florida, I I wouldn't worry too much about what is the interplay with my policy in Florida. But if I were a Democrat going forward, I'd be very worried about what is the interplay of my policy in Wisconsin. Or even be thinking about like what is the interplay of my policy in Texas if you're trying to pick up Texas. But I think the
Hmm.
realignment of the electoral college map will, I should hope, change some of Democratic policy preferences too, to better reflect what states they are actually having to contend for.
Yeah, well, I would just go back to the suburbs. Look at how you won that Nebraska's congressional district there. So why'd you win Omaha? If we're totally an anathema to to people in the outside of the coasts. Well, because there's more to it than that. And obviously, anywhere where there's a city and the suburbs around it, there's going to be certain policy preferences. And looking at that alone, maybe actually that district alone could be your focus group for your policies moving forward. Not so much because you just want the electoral vote, though it's a nice have, but it's showing you something. It's showing you something. If it works in Omaha, well, you just got Omaha. So um, these are things to think about.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I don't know if you still want to talk, but you did bring up spending, and I don't.
I'm into it. Yeah, you want to talk about a little bit of campaign spending
Yeah, a
here?
little bit.
Yeah. All right. So I have been doing a rough crunching of the numbers here, and I mean one of the things that I think for the Democratic Party that I want to see happen, inside of the party as a liberal is I think they need to reform the primary process in a dramatic way. I think during the 2020 campaign, a lot of money was spent in the primaries on 20 something presidential candidates that that money could have been better allocated and better spent into actual down ballot races. And more importantly, I think attention could have been drawn to down ballot races that get sucked up by
Hmm.
presidential candidates running constantly and the media network and the media cycle, behind them. To that point, I was also kind of looking at some dud races here, some high profile races. So I've got a few things, but we'll talk presidential candidates. Like $14 million was spent largely by John Delaney to make John Delaney happen. $14 million was spent on Tulsi Gabbard to make Tulsi Gabbard happen. $13 million was spent on Amy Klobuchar to try to make Amy Klobuchar happen. $100 million was spent on Pete Buttigieg to try to make Pete Buttigieg happen. And in the case of all three of these candidates, really, really long shots. Now, in the case of Bernie Sanders, $160 million was spent on him to try to make his campaign happen. I don't have Biden listed here because actually, in the case of Biden, he was woefully underfunded throughout most of the Democratic primaries. So you like really can't fault. You can't say he was a drag on their money during the Democratic primaries. He may have had preferences and favoritism working for him, but just doesn't comp. And in the case of Elizabeth Warren, yeah, she spent $36 million, but she was also in front of the pack in September of 2019. So was that really like misspent cash? And then you stack that to 160 million spent by Sanders' campaign. The point is, in all of these cases, you could, if the primary race, and the pre-primary before the primary was half as long, they probably spend at least maybe 2/3 as much. You don't spend as much as was getting spent through this campaign. I just think it serves as a massive distraction. So
Well, you have the Canadian thing where they're not allowed to spend until there's an election called, you know.
this is the thing I want. I want an actual establishment of like
Mm.
an election season, like
That's
enumerated.
what you need, yeah.
Yeah, cans and can'ts. There's
Because otherwise, people will run as early as they need to, no matter when the primary is,
if
to get
there's
that advantage.
if there's no disadvantage structure. And in this case, yeah, sort of my plan. It calls for biweekly debates starting in January,
Hmm.
and then we start voting the first week of March. Um,
Hmm.
but if you do anything prior to that, you're not included in any of the biweekly debates. So basically, you're out of the race unless you have like a really I don't need the debate sort of strategy.
Right.
To it. No, but I think the party needs to create a way to control campaign spending, because the campaign spending's out of control. I mean, I've got if you throw in Amy McGrath and Jamie Harrison, that's 199 million. 67 million spent by the or donated to the Lincoln Project, and then all those primary candidates plus Gideon, which is $70 million. It's a total of $625 million spent on non-winning exercises. Oh, I left one out. This is important though. There's a guy named Michael Bloomberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, he spent $1 billion in his quixotic late push for the nomination that started in December. 1 billion, and then spent 100
Well,
million in Florida at the end of the campaign.
yeah, of course, and the Bloomberg thing shows you that money in politics. Like for many years, there was a lot of questions about whether money directly influenced it, and it does in certain situations, but there seems to be other factors that are more important too.
Yeah,
There's
there's
a
a
limit,
limit, I think.
and you never had a way to test it because there were spending limits and just limits to how much people could get into politics. Like it was tough, to raise money in the 1980s. It was not easy for a presidential candidate. People just didn't, you had to find businessmen that would actually be able to part with cash like that. Like one of the things that happens in 88 is Dukakis rises in the nomination process because of all those little kind of seven dwarf candidates among the Democrats. He had Massachusetts. He was governor. He could actually go to some business people. He was also a Greek American. He could go to like Greek American fundraisers and raise some thousands of dollars like that would actually mean something. So when you get to Super Tuesday, he's able to compete and the others don't have enough money. Now you got the internet and you got small money and you're able to actually change that. And a lot of money's being poured in. But I think like Americans do need to learn to be good consumers of political donations the way they are with other things, and to be smart. And I think, look, Jamie Harrison, I think we now see what that was, that there wasn't too much chance, but it was a nice thing for many partisan Democrats that really
Dude, no,
wanted
that
it.
was a really, really
Mhm.
nice campaign industrial complex operation run by Harrison's campaign that made his staff, I'm sure, a pretty penny.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that campaign was well funded, and the staff was well paid on it. But like it was crazy that bro,
Yeah, if you had
I was
put
getting
that
lit up by
into
Harrison. I had to unsubscribe to him on my phone a couple of times. Yeah, no,
yeah.
it was horrible. Like it
If you put that money into Teresa Greenfield in Iowa, you would have a more meaningful result for Democrats for the
I think Teresa Greenfield, if she had just gotten anywhere near the level of suction as Jamie Harrison, yeah, no, I
yeah.
think she gets over on Joni Ernst. I think so many.
Well, like I said, I don't think a system. This doesn't sound like a system problem. It does sound like we as consumers, now that we've entered political donations, where we generally speaking, generally speaking, even in the 90s, you could check your zip code. Very few people donate. Now many more Americans are, and we have to be better consumers.
No, that's true too. I mean, part of it though is then the party, because the party does control a lot of these mailing lists and stuff too. Like you just have to keep an eye on stuff. And if you see
Yeah.
Jamie Harrison's getting like turning into this like nuclear all money's going into an event, like don't do
Yeah.
that because not for nothing. The Georgia Senate races, especially by virtue of the fact that there are two of them, every 6 years, the Democratic Party should be really, really focused in on these Georgia Senate races. They're super important. As 1/50th of the Senate. No, that's like
Yeah.
serious stuff.
No, I'm with you on that point. No, all interesting, and definitely everyone thought that small money in politics was a good thing, and it is. But there's a lot of bad sides to it. I do think, just in terms of the total amount spent, I think your point is correctly more on where it's spent. The total amount spent, I have no issue with. When you look at the amount of money spent on like football gambling, let's say sports betting, it's
No, no.
hugely eclipses political small money political donations.
If
And
anything, what
people,
alarms me, when I was
yeah,
doing these numbers is at any point, a Jeff Bezos type of person could show up and go, "Nice electoral process you have here," and just yeah, $10 billion completely upsets the apple cart for both parties. Very, very.
well, they do some of that, and you do see your Sheldon Andersons. I do actually believe there's actually limits on those type of people, and why they don't always do that. Because I do think business people gonna business people, right? I don't like this political world. It's not a good investment. It
No,
can be a good investment for some things, but
I also think it
they,
depends on how much money you come in with too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's big money, but what is good about the internet money is that small voices can get heard. You can build up a movement and have it funded. George McGovern. This is an interesting story. In '72, there was actually this whole phenomenon where they were getting so much cash at the end, because even though the more the polls were against him, the more cash he got from hopeful hippies. I know that's a generalization, who wanted to see McGovern win, and believed in it in a way they didn't believe in the other. They wouldn't have believed in like Humphrey or Muskie or Lyndon Johnson, but believed in him. And so it does allow, but it was tougher then to spend it. They had to go to banks and say, look, can we get a loan against this cash we're getting? And I don't know about that. Go to radio stations and say, can we run an ad? Here's literally envelopes of cash. Well, get it into a check. It's like things like that. They couldn't spend it fast enough, and now you can.
Yeah. Right.
And that's a benefit. I'll always believe it's a benefit to politics, but I do think you're absolutely right with that Harrison example of someone needs to step in. Now, if you're talking about the Democratic Party, your prayers are answered, because when you have an incumbent president, you generally have leadership of that party. It's harder when there's no incumbent president,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah. It's true.
former president's kind of staying out of things, and you have like a Tom Perez. Nothing else to say there. I guess I'll take credit for the Biden win, but that would be pretty bold.
It would be like Pelosi and Perez taking credit for the Biden win. It's kind of like, okay, let's talk about that House map, and I'm aware about
Yeah.
gerrymandering and everything like
Yeah.
that. But when you are getting, you can go, okay, gerrymandering, but the flip of that is, okay, but you have a popular vote advantage that's really
Right.
reliable and steady. So like at a certain point, when it comes down to it, I think, when we're talking about the Democratic Party, and people like myself assessing the Democratic Party's performance in this election, what I am looking at is going to be, how closely were you looking at the map, and how much were you trying to go like, well, the zeitgeist of the times will help us deliver a stirring rebuke to Donald Trump and Trumpism because his awfulness is manifest, and I have to look at this map too closely. I think, if anything, this election, I hope, is a wake up call, if not for the establishment, for partisans and stuff, that like, this is a game of X's and O's. You've got to count every vote. Every vote
Hmm.
matters. You've got to be looking at every district. Every district matters. So you get surprised if you don't know the lay of the land. And when you're
And
thinking,
you got to find your issues and find a way to communicate those issues in a language that is gonna, just this abstract, like we have to reach out to the 70 million, and that doesn't really interest me. Reconciliation or
I only
reaching out.
care about those people insofar as they're in districts that I think are gettable districts, basically. Well, you know what I mean? Like
It sounds fictitious. Yeah, there's
yeah,
a fictitiousness to it. What you do have to do, though, is to get into some of that 70 million, with support for your programs. You're not going to pass a thing on the 75, 6, or 8 million, whatever the Biden total turns out to be. You're not going to pass a thing on that alone. You're going to have to find language and ways to get that so it sells. You're going to have to think about things. I was always, as a fairly liberal person, I mean, I was supportive of the ACA. However, I absolutely hated the individual mandate and those components. It's just, I think it's led
It's
to
not an
all the
accident that
problems that
Trump
they've
was trying
had.
to campaign on that on his way out the door here.
All for people, getting healthcare, subsidizing healthcare for the poor, things like this. Requiring everyone to buy health is exactly the type of thing you're going to have to watch, and you're going to get whatever opposition you got in 2010. The way social media is now, it's going to be magnified, and it's going to be,
The
so you're
way
going to have to think about how you
misinformation is
communicate
now
issues.
too. I mean, there's always been misinformation and bad stuff out there in the world, but like their political misinformation is more weaponized and ritualized and has been kind of refined over the last 4 or 5 years. It's involved and it uses social media and targets more effectively. So yeah, I'm with you. Like policies like that, you just gotta think about what's the sell on it and be careful that you're not putting something out there that is
And oddly enough, everyone having cell phones in their pocket, we thought it would mean that everyone's at home playing video games or something like that, or texting. But actually, it makes it easier to participate in the same way we did in the 19th century with wide awakes and torchlight parades. People can now also have a politics on their foot, going out demonstrating in their local areas or in cities or in wherever. And you're seeing a lot more of that, certainly. And that should continue too. Working that into your strategy is going to be important for both parties to think about. If you have a policy that you're going to push forward, think about where are you going to get those wide awake clubs to come out and support it and call for it and petition you to pass the policy, which is often how the best policies get done. Well, Chris, I think I have exhausted myself.
No, I think we've discussed plenty. I've got more to discuss with other people. I got Sean Frieder and Lindsay Duke here in the not so distant future. So everyone check that out over at don'tworry.tv. If you enjoyed today's episode, I should mention, I think it's been like soft rolled out, but I have not like officially announced it on the show yet. Like we now have a video adjunct and a video companion to Don't Worry About the Government. You can go to YouTube, search for Don't Worry About the Government, or DWATG. Also, just go to the DWATG Twitter at DWATG, and you can click the link and get to our YouTube channel. I'm putting out right now, I was doing like 2 a week. Man, we're going to try to shoot for 1 to 2 a week of YouTube videos. There'll be a few little cliplets of the video version of this episode. But if you want the full video version of the show, that is now available as a new nice feature for the Patreon subscribers. Love you people. Hi, hello. Hope you've been enjoying my gesticulations throughout the show. I'm a handsy talker that comes with the Italian background. But you can sub up over at patreon.com/DWATG. A buck a show is all we ask. Support the show, get the video. It creates a rhyming scheme that's really pleasant on the ears. Bruce Carlson, where can people find your works on the internet?
www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Link there to the Patreon site where you can actually support the program.
Awesome. Don't Worry About the Government, ostensibly weekly podcast, listener supported. So go and sub up. I want to thank Bruce Carlson so much for coming on the show. I want to thank y'all so much for listening and supporting the show. And until the next one, bye-bye.